Begin, we'll see. I'm sure more people will come in with a hello again. And thank you very much for being present today. This is the third lecture of Grandmothers for Gun Responsibilities Back to School program. We began early this summer with our summer school program and had as our first lecture, first speakers, Kathy DeForest, who is with us this morning, who leads a group called Visioning Beyond Violence, looking at how the arts are a tool for social change and a tool for the prevention of gun violence. A very exciting creative program that we hope to connect more with as we move forward. Our second was Ilana Landsberg Lewis, a member of our advisory council, a Canadian woman, our Northern Good Friends Canada, who talked to us about how Canada has had such success. She and her team have had such success building a program called Grandmother to Grandmother, and gave us some really helpful hints on how to build an organization of grandmothers, grandfathers, and how to approach fundraising for such an organization. This is our third program, and we're very happy to welcome David Riedman. I will introduce him in one more minute. I just want to say, in terms of a housekeeping thing, David will talk for 15, 20 minutes, and then we're going to go into Q&A and discussion. So please put any questions or comments in the chat. That is easier for us to access. Many of you are members of Grandmothers for Gun Responsibility. Several of you are members of the Advisory Council. You are all friends, members of our Communications Committee. Thank you. We are a generation in action. We are dedicated to preventing gun violence among children and teens in particular. As you all know, I'm sure at this point, it is the number one cause of their deaths. And we cannot accept this without action and genuine, full court press effort every day to do something about this, to do many things about this. Our vision is that we imagine a time, a world where no child, no parent, no grandparent, no one needs to fear the harm that gun violence causes. So how do we get there? How do we get to that point where we can be effective and have an impact and spark change? One way is to learn as much as we can about gun violence, all the different manifestations of it, risk factors, patterns, promising remedies, the evidence, what does the research point us toward? And that's what brings us to school together, so we can all learn together. And I am really so thrilled that David has accepted our invitation to be our professor today. And speaking of professor, today is a very exciting day because yesterday, David defended his dissertation, and he is now Dr. David Riedman. So yeah, this is, I believe, David, your first presentation as Dr. Riedman. Is that correct?
It is, and I agreed to this a couple months ago when we started sorting this out, and I certainly would not have been doing anything today. I'm fairly exhausted from the defense and the preparation and the couple weeks of anxiety to get up to that point. But when you were on my podcast a couple months ago and we had an excellent discussion and we talked over the summer about doing this event and set the date, that was set for today, and the dissertation got set for yesterday. So we move on and we move forward. So I look forward to chatting with all of you.
Thank you for keeping your word. That is really terrific. Thank you. So we're going to hear from David now, but I just want you to know that I was a guest on his podcast, which was just a wonderful experience. And it became clear to me that David has almost single-handedly amassed the most exhaustive, complete, and compelling database on school shooting that exists in this country. And his work goes back to 1970. He looked back to 1970 to pull all this data together and has been able to help us all learn and discern really relevant factors about school shootings, both cause, both perhaps impact, perhaps prevention. We will talk more about it, but it is an illuminating set of information that David has pulled together. And so with that, Dr. Riedman, let me welcome you and invite you to begin. We will put your cute questions or comments in the chat box as we go along, and we will get to them. Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds good. So I'm a assistant professor at Idaho State University. I teach in the Department of Emergency Services there. But before this, going back a couple of years, I was in a postgraduate postmaster's program at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and I was there in a classroom in February 2018 when the Parkland shooting happened. And I was in a program that was supposed to be identifying the future threats that Homeland Security as a concept and enterprise needed to be thinking about for the next generation. And I'd worked in the Department of Homeland Security for more than a decade before that. And I'd done, exhaustive work on the Boston Marathon bombing and on terrorism prevention. But we never talked about school shootings. And so I'm looking at the news that day as I'm sitting in a classroom, and 17 kids were killed and 17 more, were wounded that day. Well, there were 2 people killed in the Boston Marathon bombing. I mean, there were lots of heroic things done that day to keep the death toll so low, but something where 2 people died created years and years of work and research. Something where 17 people died or murdered in an instant was a topic that I'd never heard discussed in any sort of government meeting. So I immediately had an idea that there's a lot that we know about counterterrorism. There's a lot that we know about see something, say something. Why don't we just create a version of that for schools? And that seemed like a great idea. But as it turns out, I'm kind of an evidence-based person. So I wanted to know if there's this kind of toolkit or this kind of checklist, how many school shootings would it actually stop? Instead of just putting a good idea out there, I wanted to put some evidence behind it and see, would this really make a difference? So since I was in a government program, contacted some folks at the FBI, and they didn't have any sort of information or list about school shootings. So I did some research. The Secret Service had been involved in violence prevention at schools since they were pushed into that position post-Columbine. So at that point, that was 19 years had passed. And I talked to some folks at the Secret Service, and they also didn't have any sort of list of school shootings. So that created like this new problem. If all of the headlines in February 2018 were about school shootings getting worse or an epidemic of gun violence, or maybe that this is just a one-off random situation that happens every couple of years, that was all speculation. There was no definitive way in 2018 to say how many shootings happened this year, how many shootings happened last year. Was the problem getting better or worse? Were the characteristics of the incidents changing? Is the who, what, where, when, and why of the incidents changing? If you don't know any of those things, then there's no way to figure out if any programs that you're implementing are successful. There's no way to know if security improvements or school policing is making a difference. If you're not benchmarking like basic information about a problem, then you can't know whether something's better or worse and what's making a difference. So I started then with a classmate as just our class project, pulling a list together. And we just continued to add more and more incidents, first trying to find just the deliberate planned attacks like Parkland and Columbine and Sandy Hook. But then there was all of these other incidents that would come up when you would search for school shootings or look through the newspaper archives, where maybe there was a fight in the hallway and multiple kids were shot during the fight. Well, that wasn't premeditated. Somebody didn't go in with a plan to do that, but it seemed like that was something that was happening pretty frequently at schools. So that seemed like it was something that was important to record. Then there were suicides that were occurring at schools, many of them very public and very violent, involving both students and staff members. Well, that's another problem. It's only one person who's the fatality, but there are, in some cases, hundreds of students in the cafeteria who witness it when a middle school kid stands up on the table and kills himself in front of them. That seemed like an entirely different issue. Then also in the news alert searches in the newspaper archives, there was domestic violence at schools. Because if you have an estranged spouse and maybe they have a protective order from work or other places, they know that their former spouse is going to be at the school during pickup and drop off. And so it seemed like there was a pattern over time where there have been more than 100 domestic violence shootings at schools, and the majority of them are in those pickup and drop off times. Well, if a school is investing in threat assessment, if a school is trying to identify, possible warning signs of violence, how many schools have a way for parents to report if there's a restraining order or just domestic violence or fear of violence, and have that factored in to some sort of plan for drop off and dismissal? So it seems like that's another issue that's been overlooked. Then going deeper, there were also a number of accidents involving guns at schools. And these were school police officers in most cases, because they're the ones who carry guns at campus the most. And often these officers were firing their guns because they're bored. They're sitting in an office or they're standing in front of the school, and they, never really thought that they were going to be a school police officer. So they spend their whole day practicing quick draws or bumping their handgun in and out of their holster because it's a habit when they're bored. And they end up firing their guns in the hallways, in classrooms, in the cafeteria, in offices. So that has enormous policy implications, because states like Florida and Texas have created a mandate that there's an armed person on every single school campus. Well, is that increasing risk or decreasing risk? Because if we know that there's a pattern over the last 60 years of school police officers who are bored and not engaged, accidentally firing their weapons, then adding even more armed people to schools is just going to further increase the chance that somebody is accidentally shot. So the scope of this research extended beyond those deliberately planned attacks into 18 different categories that the shootings can fall into. Everything from domestic violence to accidents, murder, suicides, anger over grades and discipline. That includes former employees. Often when a teacher or a school staff member is fired, they come back to the school because it's their workplace, and it ends up being a workplace shooting. So then to further organize this information, it's grown and grown. So there are about 300 variables that I code for every one of the shootings. And there are things like knowing the time on the clock that a shooting occurred really doesn't mean a lot in the context of a school, but knowing the time period of the school day. Was it arrival? Was it dismissal? Was it lunch? Was it an after-school activity? Was it a sporting event? That matters a lot. The exact location within the school. Did it happen in a classroom or a hallway or the cafeteria, the library? Was it inside or outside of the building? Was the shooting in multiple different rooms or all in a single room? And those have all led to really novel and counterintuitive findings around this. So, for example, one of the biggest investments to prevent school shootings and I should put prevent in quotes for all of these, is to fortify classroom doors and to have one-way locks on classroom doors. Well, when I've looked at 240 deliberately planned attacks at schools, about 70% of them started and ended inside the same room.
Hmm.
So first, if it starts and ends inside the same room, what good does a bulletproof door do? And then if it's starting and ending in the same room, how was the incident stopped? Because if there's now a locked, fortified door between that person, whoever is going to come in and try to stop it, you might be making the situation even worse. So I think that is what this data has done. It's created a lot of different new research opportunities. There are, last time I checked, I think close to 500 peer-reviewed papers that people have written with this data. And every one of those is finding new and unique either characteristics of the shootings, the impacts to students, to their communities, to the economies, to our healthcare system, to the home values in regions. There's an unbelievable amount of cost, both in life and trauma, and lost dollars in our society, as well as misappropriated dollars that may not be doing anything to actually prevent this problem. So I've just tried to spend these last couple of years creating the most robust data source available so that it can inform policy, so that other people can do research within areas that I know nothing about. And ultimately, we can bring some, hopefully, sense to a problem that has been driven by people's individual speculations and assertions rather than evidence for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And just one more point, and then I'd like to open it up to questions. So Margaret mentioned the data going back to 1970. It's actually back to 1966,
Mm.
which I did to align with the Violence Project, which is a group that I work closely with at Hamline University. And they have a public mass shooting database that starts with the Austin Tower shooting in 1966. But now that I'm done with my dissertation, I think one of the goals for the next few months is to take this back to the end of World War II, so that it can be kind of the modern picture of gun violence at schools in the United States. So I just got, an email a couple days ago from somebody saying, you're missing an incident, and it was a shooting from 1962. And, that's outside of the period right now. But when I looked at it, it was the same as any of the others. It was a student at the school, and he opened fire with a revolver because it was 1962, and killed two students and wounded, a dozen or so others at the school in 1962. And that's the same sort of circumstances that I've seen in the late 60s and into the 70s and into the 80s. And I think every time a school shooting happens, people either say this is a new problem, or they cite some sort of current issue as being the driver. Is it social media? Is it kids who have a higher rate of antidepressant drugs? Is it violent video games? Is it the internet? Is it R-rated movies? There, in every generation, there has been a pop culture issue that is blamed for being the source of school shootings. But if you look back in history, and if a shooting that happened in 1962 has all of the same circumstances, and if you clipped the date off of the article, it could be the same thing that happened last week in Denver, then all of these kind of pop culture war associations across generations are spurious. That we really need to get to the root cause. And I think that root cause is gun responsibility. That if a teenager has a gun, it's because somebody was not a responsible owner with that firearm. And that's been the case for 60 years. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
David, thank you very much. There is a question that's come in, and then there are some other ones I'd like to pose to you. But we appreciate your ending on the note of responsibility, since we are grandmothers for gun responsibility. We share that, whether it's individual responsibility or collective responsibility, whether you're the mayor of a small town or the governor of a state or a member of the U.S. Senate or your local town council. When we collect and collectively share this responsibility, we can get somewhere, I believe. Thank you, thank you, thank you. First question in is, John, do you want to pose it or do you want me to pose it?
Why don't you pose it?
Okay, I'll pose it. First question comes from John, who's a member of our communications committee. Can you share some of the highlights of your findings? Yes, good, thank you.
Yeah, I think the most shocking finding is when you look at this full scope of gun violence, not just the incidents like Parkland and Sandy Hook and Uvalde that get the national and international media attention. It's that this is not a couple times a year problem. This is not a couple times a month problem. This is an every single day at a school somewhere in the country problem. The number of shootings peaked right after students returned after COVID. So there were about 350 shootings at schools in the year when students were back. And I think that we can't say for sure, but there's certainly a lot of evidence that the lack of socialization and time during lockdown may have contributed to a lot of conflicts when students came back together that they didn't know how to deal with without resorting to violence. And that was combined with, we've seen the biggest period of gun sales in our country's history. So not only were kids returning from an isolated time away, but they returned with homes that had many more guns left open and available. And even if kids are not in a home that has a gun, when lots of states have changed their laws so people can carry guns in public and leave loaded guns in vehicles and so on, it's very easy for a teenager who wants a gun to figure out where to steal it from. So I think the two big changes post-COVID are many more guns and many students who were lacking some social skills from the trauma of that isolation. The good news is that since that peak in 2022, the number of shootings have been decreasing on campus. So actually the peak was 2023. There were 350 shootings on campus. In 2024, it dropped to 336, so small change. And then so far this year, there have been 177. There are about 100 days left in the year. So it'll probably end up somewhere around 280 or so shootings that happen at schools this year. And that will be about a 17% decline. So that's going in the right direction. And that aligns with a lot of national data that's showing that violent crime has been falling across the country, particularly in urban areas. Now, just to give you an idea of what every day means. So just last week at K through 12 schools, a man was killed and two other people were wounded during a homecoming event in Mississippi. An assistant principal was standing outside of a middle school in Illinois at dismissal, which is what she does every day. And her husband came to the campus with a rifle and fired 30 shots at her during dismissal and killed her and killed another person. There were two teens that were shot in front of a school in Washington, D.C. It's unclear if the National Guard was cleaning the sidewalks nearby when that happened, because we've heard that there's no violent crime in Washington, D.C. anymore, but these two teens were shot in front of the school. An adult was shot at a high school football game in Louisiana. Two groups of teens fired shots at each other. All those shots missed during a high school football game in Maryland. Two teens were caught in Texas at an elementary school on a weekend day with an AR-15, and they'd fired 60 rounds on the campus. There was an elementary school bus that was taking kids home when it was hit by a bullet. Luckily, none of the kids were hurt, but it just missed the driver. A student was shot during a fight on a campus during dismissal in Ohio, and a student fired shots during a fight at dismissal in California. But fortunately, there were no injuries. And so this stuff is every day. Even just yesterday morning in San Diego, before school started at an elementary school, people spotted a person on campus, and they thought he had a gun. And when police arrived, there was a guy sitting outside of the school, and he had both a gun and a knife. And when police approached him, they ended up needing to fatally shoot him. And so this stuff happens at these schools every single day. And I think that's been the big finding that's come out of measuring that full scope of gun violence.
David, you're knowing this and you're being able to share it and provide it to us so eloquently and compellingly is a long journey from where your early point where the government was doing nothing about this, was not even considering a school shooting as relevant or pertinent to their missions. So, and I really credit you for having raised the profile on this.
Yeah, and the government still isn't.
Okay.
This is data that I track on my own. This is not a funded project. I don't have a team. I do all of this work myself. The government does come to me for information. So I get contacted by the FBI and the Secret Service and state governments for information. But this is not information that the government tracks. And the way that the national crime statistics are organized, it's not easy to search by specific location types. So you can't just search, school in the FBI crime statistics and find, shootings or crimes at schools. So this is information that somebody in the government would need to make an effort to collect, and they just don't. And even if they did, I think as we learned from the pandemic and, what we know from public health and epidemiology is that you need to be able to track problems in real time to see if you're in the midst of a change or a spike or even an exponential growth curve. And the crime statistics in our country take so long to compile that they come out 2 years after the fact. So if we didn't get our, say, COVID case data until 2 years later, well, you'd be over and done with a pandemic before you even knew you were in a pandemic. I think that that's one of the principal issues with the lack of data collection in general for all types of crime at the federal level.
I know, David, and there are two more questions that have come in that I will get to in just a second, but I know you have been contacted, if not by the full range of government, by the media. A lot of media are tuning into your database. Can you comment on that? And is that a hopeful sign that the media is picking up on this?
Yeah. I work with all of the major news organizations, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, all have access to the real-time information. So when something happens, they can make an infographic or be able to reference the number of shootings that happens. I think that that's been really helpful to cut through some of the kind of anecdotal statements that you might have in a shooting, to be able to put an objective measure that, this is the 50th time that this happened. There are these, 10 victims are the, 140th through 150th people shot at a school this year. It provides a lot of context there. It also helps when we're in a situation now where we can't necessarily believe all of the information that comes from official sources or kind of well-funded, recognized sources, having this data is a way to combat that type of misinformation. I was speaking with the New York Times yesterday because the Heritage Foundation published some report claiming that half of school shootings are related to somebody being transgender. And I thought that doesn't make any sense. So their claim was that since 2015, that half of school shootings were committed by a transgender person. And when I looked through the cases that would fit generally what Heritage Foundation was referring to as a school shooting, there are about 75 incidents over that time period. 3 of those were possibly a transgender person, only one a legally recognized transgender person. Another case was a kid who was using a female name instead of his name, but he was still a teenager and not involved in any formal treatment or any kind of formally recognized declaration of a different gender. And then the other is the Covenant school shooter in Nashville. And an episode of my podcast, we went over the manifesto with a forensic psychologist. And there seems to be very serious personality disorder and possibly even having 2 different personalities based on the different types of handwriting and different descriptors, and somebody that was in a very self-loathing spiral of depression and blame and hate in many different directions. But even not clearly, there was probably some gender dysmorphia in multiple directions, but not necessarily something that was driving biology or ideology in this. So I think having this information can be so important, because first, if other people, we just create more division and more reason for people to feel alienated and feel lost. And we know that can in itself can push people to gun violence. But also, if we blame the wrong people, then we aren't doing anything to stop the actual causes. So I think that's really the power of this data.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The power of this data. Absolutely. Thank you. A question from Kathy Swerdlow from the League of Women Voters in Florida. Do you have a top 10 list of what changes policy schools can make that are most effective, or top 5?
Yeah, I think there are 2 things to keep it really simple. One is inside of schools and one is outside of schools.
Okay.
So starting outside of schools, it's regardless of what state or local laws say, people need to keep their guns locked and unloaded. And if you keep your guns locked and unloaded, almost all school shootings are committed by current or recently former students at the school. Most of them are between 13 and 17. So these are kids who can't buy a gun from a gun store. So that means they're taking it from their home, a relative's home, a friend's home, or they're stealing it from somewhere. And in any of those cases, there is a gun owner who is not being responsible with their gun if it was available to be taken or stolen. So I think the biggest thing that could prevent almost all of these shootings is keeping guns away from children and teens who shouldn't have them. I would hope that regardless of anyone's political affiliation, that seems like a pretty straightforward message. The top thing that schools can do, I have a paper that's in peer review right now where we looked at 125 averted school shootings. And these averted shootings, there was somebody that had intent, had a clear plan, and either had weapons or was trying to get access to weapons. Of those 125 plots, more than 80% of them were prevented because a classmate or a friend or a family member made a tip to report it.
Mm-hmm.
Only one of those cases out of the 125 was a formal threat assessment team identifying the plot. It's informal mechanisms, which are completely free, creating a way for students to speak up and report that either one of their classmates or one of their friends or a family member is having a problem, that is the best way to prevent planned attacks from happening. I also did a study last school year where I see many, many news alerts every day for students arrested with guns. They didn't have any intent to shoot somebody. It seems that there are lots of middle school and high school kids who habitually carry guns to school. So I put together a sample of about 1,000 cases from last year where somebody was arrested with a gun at a school. And the same thing was true there. It was more than 80% of those came from a tip from a classmate that somebody had a gun at school. It was rarely the metal detector. Kids are smart. If a school has one, they know how to get around it. It was rarely something that, came out of a random search. There are schools that do that. And from listening to statements from students and parents, that makes kids feel targeted. They feel like the bad guys. They don't have any trust in their school when they get randomly searched. But if you do have a network of trust and a kid is willing to say that their classmate has a gun, that is how most guns are found on campus.
That is really interesting and important. I guess a question that would come to me anyway, and then there are several more I will bring up. Do kids know to whom to give the tip? Do kids generally know where to go and to whom to go in their schools? Or is that something that a group like grandmothers could help provide the public?
Yeah, that is an ad hoc process that's different in every state and often different in every county. And there are organizations like Sandy Hook Promise that provide a tip line, but that's something that your school district has to be enrolled in.
Okay.
So there's not a standardized system. I've said for years that we did a great job with See Something, Say Something. For terrorism, that was everywhere. There was a phone number and an email address and a website on those posters. And the description is simple. Anybody can understand it. And, it was everywhere, airports and subways and public spaces. And we've done a great job with terrorism prevention in the country. But that tip line and information reporting just does not exist for school shootings. And sadly, even when the tips do get reported, the FBI and local police departments often mishandle or don't appropriately investigate these threats. So, just last week, there was a planned attack at a school in Denver. Sorry, that was 2 weeks ago, at Evergreen High School. And the Anti-Defamation League, looking at online internet content, had identified threats from that teenager over the summer. They gave that information to the FBI, and then the FBI determined that there wasn't a probable cause to take any action on that. If you think back to Parkland, the FBI paid $128 million settlement after Parkland because they interviewed the shooter and then they misfiled the report. So nothing ever took place after that. And then just in the news today, so last year at Appalachia High School in Georgia, there's a student who opened fire inside the school with an AR-15. And both of the victims who were killed just filed $25 million lawsuits against the sheriff's department and the school district there, because the sheriff's department was notified by the FBI about threats that the student was making online. The police went to his residence, and the officers didn't take it seriously. They botched the interview. They didn't follow any of the best practices in an interview, and they didn't follow up. So then a couple months later, the day of the shooting, the kid's mother lived in another state. She knew from some of his text messages that there was a problem, and his mother called the school and said there's about to be a shooting on campus. And she called them more than an hour before the shooting started. But for whatever reason, the school didn't have a plan and the staff didn't have training, and they didn't take all the actions that they could have to prevent the shooting from happening. So that school district is going to end up probably paying, $50 million. Our education dollars are scarce.
Mm-hmm.
Our budgets are scarce and getting worse across the country.
Mm-hmm.
Yet people are failing at every level with this. And it's really, really maddening that either we don't give people a system to report information, or sometimes when they do make that effort to report information, the agencies that we trust to do something have failed repeatedly.
Sounds like an area that needs attention and change, for sure. David, there's some very nice expressions of gratitude for your work and the contribution it's making. Thank you for your impressive work. There's a question that has to do with hearing from Jane, hearing about the frequency of school shootings. What can you say about school shootings, about what shootings we hear about in the media? What role do you see the media in playing to either help or hinder social and legal action?
Yeah, it's almost to a T. You can tell based on the number of victims killed whether there's going to be sustained media coverage. And if there are more than 4, and usually more than 10 victims killed, which is pretty rare, something will get sustained attention for sometimes a week or two. In some cases like Parkland or Uvalde, those shootings will get attention for years. When there are not very many victims killed, even if there are many people wounded and many bullets fired in various serious situations, the attention falls away almost entirely. And thinking about just 2 weeks ago, there was a planned attack inside the cafeteria of a Denver high school in the suburbs. It's the highest graduation rate school in the state. Very nice, affluent area. That should be an area where a shooting that happens there gets a lot of attention. But there were not a high number of fatalities. There were 2 students who were critically wounded, and the 15-year-old who committed it killed himself. So that just does not get attention, even though it was certainly very serious. Unlike the others, he didn't have an AR-15. He didn't even have a modern handgun. He had a revolver. But he wanted to harm people. He reloaded the revolver 5 times during the shooting as students were trying to run and get away. So that's just a very fortunate case that multiple people weren't killed, but it doesn't move the needle on prevention or attention because it didn't have that body count. The same with the shooting at the Catholic school in Minneapolis earlier in August. That was more than 100 shots fired with an AR-15 rifle into the church of the school. But mainly because it was a church built, I think, in 1903 with, heavy stone walls, and the person was firing from the outside. Most of the bullets didn't go through the walls, or they ricocheted. And fortunately, most of the kids, were wounded instead of killed in that circumstance. But that could have easily been, one of the worst shootings to ever happen. But instead, it doesn't get attention. And then finally, the most frequent circumstances are students who are shooting at each other during fights, the domestic violence on campus, the suicide on campus. Those get no attention. Those might get a couple paragraphs in the local news or 30 seconds, on the evening TV news. And that's it. There's no GoFundMe for the victims. There are no extra counseling services from around the country sent to the schools. to help all the kids who witnessed this violence. So I think that those are really the forgotten victims, because when you realize that hundreds of these shootings happen every year, that's thousands of kids that witness, somebody being shot or in many cases killed at their school, and they never have any help, and those families never have any help.
Let me, before I go to another question or two, pause and say, would anybody like to raise his or her hand, her or his hand, to ask a question that they haven't put into the chat? Okay. In the chat is a link to David's database. If you would like to copy that and have that and share that, that would be really excellent for us to help get the word out. And then Jody Foster, Jody, you're talking about the recent Tacoma case where a 13-year-old plan was averted, 13-year-old's plan was averted. The police found 23 plus unsecured and secured guns in his home. That is a stockpile of guns. Jody, thank you. So how was it averted? Do you know, Jody? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we've been talking about how to avert. If you're
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know. I just was stunned and listening to David's point about so many of these are in their own homes. They have access to them at
Yeah.
home.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, I believe the Tacoma case was a tip from somebody about some online activity from the student. But yeah, so there are two links in the chat. One is to the K-12 SSDB, which is K-12 School Shooting Database .substack.com. Substack is where I publish a weekly article as well as a weekly podcast. There's also a link to K12SSDB.org, and that is the school shooting database website where there are charts, graphics, interactive maps, and a lot of information about the details of the shooting. So those are two different resources. But to the point on the averted attack in Tacoma and having numerous firearms in the house, one of my recent episodes of my podcast was with a professor from Germany, Dr. Anna Nassur from Erfurt University there. And she's a sociologist, and she has been writing articles about school shootings for the last couple of years, and she's working on a book now on it. And I think the biggest finding that we talked about in the last episode is she looked at the deliberately planned attacks back to the 1960s, and she was able to find a lot of details on about 100 of those attacks. 98% of those school shooters had easy access to a firearm in their home. Mm-hmm. And the majority of them were homes where either hunting or firearm related activities were the family's primary hobby.
Primary. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So 98% had easy access to a gun, I think can be interpreted in two ways. One, that easy access to a gun certainly makes it easier for a teen to commit a school shooting. But on the other side, that means if there's not easy access to a gun, that little bit of friction may be enough to prevent somebody from ever making that sustained effort to commit a school shooting. I think the second point is on the family having their primary family bonding activities be firearms related. That is something that probably connects closely with gun accessibility around the house, because if it's a family that is very comfortable with firearms and people of all ages are using firearms and they're given as gifts for birthday and Christmas and so on, then the chances that there are going to be unsecured guns around the home, it seems likely that that's higher.
Thank you. David, a question has come in from John on your opinion of the Sandy Hook school shootings commercial that came out, I think, about a week or 2 weeks ago. Do you know that commercial, the Sandy Hook school?
Yeah, I've seen a number of those. I think that we have a kind of broader social issue where the people who recognize gun violence at schools and easy access to firearms for children as a problem all understand that that's a problem and we don't need anything to convince us of it. People who adamantly think that firearms are absolute rights, that they need to have their firearm with them and accessible 24 hours a day, or people that even think it's just fine for their kids to have access to guns without them around. I don't think that any of those people would have their mind changed by seeing a 30-second commercial. So I think that it's something that just continues to reinforce the things that we know, but they're the things that we're already doing and the things that we already would spot as problems. And for people that want to dismiss all evidence about risk and about the variables that go into these shootings, a commercial is not going to change their mind.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Good. Okay. Couple things as we move toward our closing minutes. Hannah has shared that there is a free training through Right to Be about preventing target violence, and they teach the warning signs to look for, what to look for, and what to do. So Right to Be is a resource for people to be aware of. Then I'm wondering if anybody, again, would like to offer a comment, if not a question, if anybody has a closing thought before I kind of summarize and thank David. Oh, Linda, good. And then Kathy, good. Linda.
Did yet? No. This has been really sad and sobering. I have 7 grandchildren, and 2 of them were in a lockdown last week when that Evergreen shooting happened, because there was a call into the Boulder district school system that there might be an active shooter. And so they have not personally yet witnessed a school shooting, but they have had numerous times when there's been a school lockdown. They were in closets in the dark, hiding and waiting for 2 hours. They shut down the school and the kids they have no information. They don't know what's happening and they're scared. And this kind of repetitive experience can't be good psychologically for teenagers or these, ones in middle school, as they're growing up. So I'm very aware of the horrible repercussions for people who lose children in school shootings, and people who witness it. But I think there's a corollary repercussion for so many kids who are experiencing just the fear and the insecurity about going to school at all. And that's true for the parents too. But so I thank you for your work. I hope that, as sad and sobering as it is, maybe it's also very inspiring maybe we can all make a little difference somewhere in our local school systems. So thank you.
Yeah, I think pushing back on lockdowns is very important, because there's lots of evidence that they're far more harmful than they are helpful. Because during an actual shooting, when most begin and end inside the same room, a lockdown doesn't do anything. And when bullets can easily go through walls and doors, it doesn't necessarily do anything. And those kids in Uvalde were following the lockdown instructions, and that certainly did not help any of them in those classrooms. So I've been advocating for a couple of years now that I don't think schools should have a lockdown procedure or do any sort of lockdown training. And that's something that's echoed by the National Association of School Nurses. I was on the New England Journal of Medicine podcast with Cornelia Griggs, who's a pediatrician at Mass General, and she's part of the Physicians for Gun Safety Group, and they do not think that lockdowns are appropriate. And Every Town for Gun Violence, Moms Demand Action, and Students March for Our Lives are all groups that don't believe that there should be lockdowns at schools. So I think that's something where there's no evidence that ever went into creating lockdown plans. It was just an assertion that somebody had. And when people get touched by the good idea fairy, sometimes those things become institutionalized. But there's no evidence suggesting that lockdowns are the most effective thing during an emergency. We tell people to run, hide, fight. Run is the top thing to do in all circumstances. Get away from the danger. Yet in schools, we tell kids to do the opposite of that, and it's had very, very bad outcomes for them. And then the last point on the lockdowns, I had a podcast with a psychiatrist, and we talked about the lockdowns, and he talked about the importance of rehearsal. So if somebody's thinking about committing violence, it's very hard to just do that the first time. But if a kid has been doing lockdown drills every single time, every single year, or multiple times a year, and they're thinking about violence, each one of those drills gets to be a rehearsal where they're imagining themselves as the shooter, where they're thinking about what everybody else is doing, where they're thinking about the power that that person that they're imagining has over everyone in the school, as everyone in the school is scared, as everyone in the school is taking an action based on it. So it becomes a ritual and a rehearsal that reinforces how to be powerful, how to be seen, and exactly how to carry that violence out. So I think we really need to push back on just the really widespread harm that lockdowns are probably doing.
That is fascinating, and that is worthy of a whole additional conversation.
Mm.
It is, because looking at the psychological impact on kids, on their parents, on their grandparents, on teachers. I've talked to a number of teachers over the years who are frightened and stressed, and teaching is not what it was once for them due to this fear and threat and these rehearsals. So I'm glad you and other groups are taking a good look at this and standing up against the kind of, what did you call it, fairy wish, something.
A lot of the school security industry is the good idea fairy.
The good idea fairy.
Yeah, whether it's attack drones or bulletproof chalkboards or safe rooms. These
Right.
are things that somebody just gets a good idea and somehow they get a product made or they get something into a school. Lots of lobbying that happens behind the scenes to get legislation and funding that is worded so that only specific products can qualify for it. We need to remember that this stuff is not evidence-based, and it's really not particularly effective. We just need to make sure kids can't get their hands on guns, and make sure that if somebody's in crisis, that their classmates and friends and relatives know how to get them connected with help and to report a problem.
That's lovely. That's right. Kathy next, and then John, and then we're going to have to wrap up, but we can certainly get Dr. Riedman back when he's not one day post dissertation defense, although it didn't show at all, David. You've been great. Kathy.
Well, David, I just wanted to thank you. And I wanted people to know that we've developed a middle school curriculum with teachers in Oakland, California, that we've implemented for 6 years in math and art and humanities. And it's a curriculum that's free, and it helps students look at every aspect of this issue, including this kind of statistics that you are supplying us with. And I just want people to know that they can access that. And I'd love to talk to you more about it, but it's very unique, and the students are becoming the change makers, and they are choosing careers based on some of this program. So I just would love to talk to you more about it, because I think education is one of the biggest preventions we can propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Visioning Beyond Violence, formerly known as Vision Quilt, is doing extraordinary work. Let me just give a shout out to them. And John, you had your hand up too.
Just a quick one, and I think I probably know the answer to this anyway, but a while ago, there was a push from, I think, certain political forces and others to have teachers arm themselves. Teachers, to have guns to, protect the children. I haven't heard much about that recently. I'm assuming that was a pretty I felt it was a pretty stupid idea, but has it gone away? What are the feelings of teachers in terms of arming themselves, and are people still pushing for that, or has that gone away?
I wish it had gone away, but unfortunately, it is something that continues to gain momentum. So 29 states currently allow teachers to carry firearms. And in Texas and Florida, every single school district is required to have at least one armed person on campus. So in rural school districts, that can be met by having a teacher or other school staff member be the armed person. I recorded 2 different episodes with a school police chief who's in charge of implementing that Guardian program in a semi-rural Texas school district. And I think that was a really kind of important, refreshing discussion to have, because he said, we don't get to decide the state mandates. We don't decide our funding. We just have to figure out how to comply. So he's tried to create a program where he finds veterans in the community, and then he does kind of vetting and training, and has created a program. And he said it's not his choice of what he wanted to do, but when you have to meet a mandate, then that seemed the most appropriate way to do it. I think that it's an enormous legal and ethical problem, because police officers have a use of force standard where they start with a low level of force, and based on the circumstances of the situation, they can escalate their use of force all the way up to the point of using deadly force against somebody. If a teacher only has a gun, their only option is deadly force. So what happens when there's a fight in the classroom? What happens when a student is running at the teacher and the teacher feels threatened? Now are those situations where the teacher can shoot a student in the classroom because they're worried that maybe that student was going to assault them and take their weapon. That's not been investigated. And then when a school shooting does happen, it's almost always a surprise attack by a student at the school. So if a teacher is up at the chalkboard and all of a sudden a student pulls a handgun or rifle or shotgun out of their bag in the classroom, that teacher needs to, in an instant, realize what's happening and fire a shot in their classroom at one of their students. That's probably not a feasible action to take. We know from lots of studies of police officers, people don't perceive things well under stress. Police officers accidentally shoot people who aren't holding guns all the time. And it's very dangerous to fire a gun when there are other people beside and behind the person that you're shooting at. So I think that it's a problem that is going to continue to grow until, unfortunately, a teacher's probably going to kill a kid in their class, and then there will be some sort of backlash and some repercussions that come from that. And I think back to Rich Neck, Virginia, a couple of years ago, where a 6-year-old pulled a gun out in his classroom and he shot his teacher. If that teacher is armed, is she supposed to shoot the 6-year-old in her class? Because what if that kid started shooting at other kids? Is she then going to be liable for not using deadly force against that kid? Nobody has thought through the legal and moral and ethical problems with arming a teacher for the purpose of killing their student. Like, that's how we need to describe armed teachers. You are arming an adult to kill a child. And I don't think that has any place in our public schools. And I don't think there's any parent who would want the teacher to be potentially the judge, jury, and executioner of a child, of their child, just because they're in that teacher's classroom.
Thank you.
Ooh, very, very serious.
Mm.
Final question, David, and then I want to say something to this strong group and thank you. The final question comes from Hannah. Would extra volunteer help or funding be beneficial for this work and for you?
Yes, yes and no. I mean, I've wanted for a long time. I hope to get this project funded by a government agency. I'm very glad that that didn't happen because, as we've seen at the start of this administration, if the government has control over your funding, the government has control over your information. And so we saw all of my peer-reviewed work on critical infrastructure protection got pulled down at the start of this administration because it had the word critical in it, and that was on a banned list. It didn't matter that it was about keeping, bridges and subways safe from terrorism. It still got scrubbed. So I think it was very important that this didn't end up as a government project. For a long time, I wanted this to be then a research center that was affiliated with the university, or have it be a university partnership project so that other students and graduate students could work on it. I'm now very glad that that hasn't happened, because with the enormous amount of political pressure on universities, this is the kind of project that could be under the influence of somebody who wants to attack a university. This could be a bargaining chip to be able to get your funding or your grants or other things back, because the current administration and the current political climate, those are folks that do not want any evidence that gun violence is a problem, and they don't want any evidence that counters their narrative, such as what we discussed earlier about transgender people and creating false information about the levels that they're perpetrating shootings. So I'm very glad that this is not a federally funded project. I'm very glad it's not a university affiliated project. I set up a nonprofit a couple of years ago, but that turned out, as I'm sure some of you have found out, to be an onerous task to manage on its own and to try to apply for grants and other things. So ultimately, this has made sense to just be a public research project that I do on my own. The Substack has a paid subscription feature, which fortunately more and more people are doing. So that brings in some revenue that helps to support me. There are a couple different individuals and organizations who make some small donations, and that is very useful because, running the project isn't free. I have web hosting fees. I have, the kind of cost of maintaining this. But yeah, I think at some point I would like to have a research assistant or some other volunteer, whether they're paid a research assistant salary or just another volunteer who's engaged to help me with this. But I've also tried to keep it as a scalable project that I can continue working on my own. So everything is welcome, but the traditional pathways of either nonprofit university or trying to get some sort of federal funding have been avenues that I think it worked out that I avoided.
Okay. David, while I thank people, if you want to put in the chat how someone could help support your work, that would be great. Is there a website, an email that you would share? That would be wonderful. Okay, thank you for the extra time you've given us, David. Thank you all for staying present and clearly staying attentive and engaged with this. You are here because you understand that gun violence is a serious, fatal, deeply disturbing, daily problem in our country, all different manifestations of it. And you are here because you are wanting to learn and to do something about it. And many of you are already well along and looking for prevention strategies and remedies and increasing public visibility and understanding on this. So I commend you. I thank you. Grandmothers welcomes all of you who are current members. Invites if you're not a member, please join. The grandmothers.org is our website. We have programs coming up in October and November. In October, we will be looking at community violence prevention interruption programs, the impact on Black and Brown communities in particular. In November, we will be have as our professor Ron Levant, who is a psychologist, who is past president of the American Psychological Association, and his area of expertise is boys and men, the psychology of boys, men, and violence. So we will be able to learn more about that. But I thank you we thank you. We're working on a national campaign on secure storage coming up. John and Maureen, as members of our communication committee, are hard at work on that because, David, we entirely agree with you that access to guns in the home and in the car, that easy access, that uninterrupted access is a serious problem and one that does have a clear remedy. I don't know if any of you saw this story this week. It's small, but it's a story that I like to take as kind of the canary in the coal mine, that Mercedes-Benz in their new models will have in their glove compartments a secure storage place for guns. Now, darn that they need to do that. Wish that weren't the case, but you know what? That's a fascinating change that they are doing that. And an example of taking, okay, we're going to sell this car, but we're going to sell it as responsibly as we can. Maybe I'm being a little naive about that. Maybe it bumps up the cost of the car. I don't know, but I'm glad to see a step like that. So thank you all. Any other questions or comments, or as we say goodbye? David, this has been outstanding. I knew it would be. You are making a hugely valuable contribution to this movement, to our national life together, and keep up the great work. And we're behind you. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. My email is there in the chat, and also on the website, there's a contact us form, and that goes directly to me. And Margaret, feel free to send out my contact information afterwards to the group as well.
I will. We will be distributing this very broadly nationally. So good to know. Okay. Thank you, Dave.